Hello and welcome.
The Grant Morrison run on Animal Man is, for the most part, a testimonial to the characters that didn't survive Crisis on Infinite Earths. In fact, the majority of the villains and heroes that appear in Animal Man are Silver Age characters that have not found a place in the modern age. Of course, Animal Man was one such character until Morrison revived the concept and gave it a more modern interpretation. Animal Man is a postmodern piece of metafiction. Without getting into all the derivations of those terms, this is what they mean in regards to the comic. Within the story, the writer becomes part of the work, which is a common trope of postmodernism. Morrison would later adapt this technique into something he called a fiction suit. The suit is something he wears so he can pretend to be a character in a fictional setting. This way he doesn't reveal he's the writer to the other characters or to the audience. Animal Man fits the criteria of metafiction because it's a story about the story you're reading. Originally, the comic was pitched as a 4-issue limited series. At some point early in the process, Morrison was asked to make the comic an ongoing series. So the first 4 issues don't really fit into the narrative that followed. They merely establish Animal Man as a modernized version of an obscure character from the 60s. Brief side note. To be accurate, within his 5 appearances in Strange Adventures, he was known as A-Man, although he was referred to as Animal Man on the cover. After those appearances, Animal Man fell into obscurity. He would become a member of the team, the Forgotten Heroes, in the early 80s. While on this team, he met many of the characters that would appear in the modern series. Characters such as Dolphin, the Sea Devils, Rip Hunter, and Immortus. End of side note. Conveniently, this brings us to one of the finest single-issue comic books of all time, Animal Man number 5, The Coyote Gospel. As most would point out, the Coyote Gospel reads like a blueprint for the remainder of the series. It may be more accurate to suggest this issue is a summary of the meta-story that runs in the background. It doesn't fully emerge until late in the series. Regardless, it reads like a radical shift in direction and a statement of intent. That is, Animal Man will not be a standard superhero comic. It will be something quite different. The plot is easy to summarize. 2 people traveling through Death Valley run over a creature. They continue on without stopping to see what it was they hit. This creature turns out to be Crafty, a being from a cartoonish reality. After being crushed, Crafty reassembles into a perfectly healed version of himself. A year passes. The driver of the truck, who is unnamed, but for the sake of this summary, let's call him Bob, returns to Death Valley to kill Crafty. He sets explosives and carries a rifle to complete this task. Bob shoots Crafty. He then drops a boulder on him and, finally, Crafty trips the explosives, causing an explosion. This is when Animal Man arrives. Crafty survives the explosion and approaches Animal Man. Crafty hands him a scroll that he has been carrying around his neck. This scroll reveals Crafty's origin. He comes from a different, lower reality where he was cast out by God for questioning the way of the world. Crafty is forced to live in Animal Man's grim and gritty reality, suffering constant pain and humiliation. Unfortunately, Animal Man doesn't understand what Crafty is communicating. At that moment, Bob shoots Crafty dead before succumbing to his injuries. There is a fair amount going on within this issue. Overall, it's an oblique criticism of the grim and gritty era of comic books. This was a time when realism trumped the fun, imaginative adventures of people with outrageous abilities. The 2 classic works, The Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen, exemplify this approach. For some, such as Grant Morrison, the entertainment value of these works was questionable. As this approach became the standard, it came off as cheap or salacious melodrama that appealed to a base, dark part of the human mind. So, in part, Animal Man questions and challenges the reader's need to witness suffering and to find it entertaining. This is underscored by Crafty being pieced back together again after being run over. It's brutal and uncomfortable to read the process of Crafty healing, or to read the details of what occurs when he's sustaining injury. This is not fun. It's not entertaining. This is an example of what occurs when you add realism to the genre. It stops being escapism and it becomes a dark, horrific mirror, reflecting ugliness and brutality. For the record, the 2 people are singing the song Roadrunner, originally performed by the Modern Lovers, although it has been covered numerous times. The song ties into the whole Looney Tunes Roadrunner cartoon vibe the story is communicating. This and a few more examples remove any doubt that the coyote in the story is a thinly veiled version of Wile E. Coyote from the Warner Brother cartoons. The truck that runs over Crafty is from Ajax Trucking. Later in the story, we learn that all of Crafty's accessories are Ajax brand. Of course, this is a reference to Acme, the company that supplied Wile E. Coyote's materials. The ridiculous levels of suffering Bob inflicts on Crafty is quite horrific, but cartoonish. It's also elaborate, like Wile E. Coyote's traps for the Roadrunner, and it's framed in such a manner that it evokes the cartoons. The final caption is also a reference to the classic tagline of the Looney Tunes cartoons. That's all, folks. Bob's motivation to kill Crafty is a bit ambiguous, although all the reasons are there. A week after originally running over Crafty, the same type of accident happens to Bob's partner. Then Bob lost his job, his mother died, and, finally, the woman that was with him when he ran over Crafty is killed. None of these events seem coincidental to Bob. The moment his life began to fall apart can be traced back to that one accident. Due to this, and his religious beliefs, Bob has come to believe Crafty is a devil who has cursed his life. Like the writer of this comic, Bob has constructed a narrative that ends in violence. However, this is not a terrible presumption on the part of Bob. In fact, he is correct. His life is cursed. His fate is intrinsically tied to Crafty. The connection is subtle. They both carry items around their necks with, quote, meaningless hieroglyphics, unquote. On a story level, both Bob and Crafty only serve one purpose, and both of them suffer greatly until that purpose is fulfilled. Crafty has to deliver a message to Animal Man. Bob then has to kill Crafty once that is accomplished. They both die almost simultaneously, without pain. Once they've served their story purpose, their suffering comes to an end. Despite both being pivotal to all that follows, neither are mentioned again for the remainder of the series. They only exist for 24 pages, and then they are forgotten. This suggests that life is cheap in these grim and gritty comics. There are 2 times Bob points his weapon directly off panel. The first time he thinks, why won't they stop? It seems he's talking about his shaking hands, but he's actually talking about the reader. Why won't the reader stop reading? Why do they keep advancing the story forward, panel by panel, forcing Bob to act and take the life of Crafty? This ties into the idea that what these characters experience is cheap entertainment for the reader. The second time he points the gun off panel, he says, Satan. This is probably in reference to Grant Morrison, the god who is making him pull the trigger. Morrison echoes this sentiment in the final issue of the series. We are repeatedly hit over the head with messianic imagery, indicating Crafty is a character who will suffer and die for the sins of the reader. He is Grant Morrison's only begotten son, in a manner of speaking. This imagery intentionally tries to misdirect us from the fact that the baton, the responsibility that Crafty carried from one reality to another, is literally passed on to Animal Man. It will be Animal Man's burden to continue this journey, traveling from his comic book reality into yet another reality. The cover mirrors the final panel of the issue with one slight change. Animal Man is in the place of the coyote, which is exactly what this cover indicates. Animal Man will take the place of the coyote in the story, and he will carry on the mission to confront God. The crossroads imagery will be represented again in the final issue, as Animal Man approaches the comic book home of Grant Morrison. There is one element to the series that is obliquely illustrated. That would be the implicate order of reality. This is an important element to the overall series, and finding a reference to it in the Coyote Gospel may involve a leap of faith to make a connection. This isn't wild speculation, but it is tenuous at best. Naturally, this leads to the question, what is implicate order? In very basic terms, reality is made of explicate and implicate order. There's what we see in experience, that would be the implicate order. And then there's the level of complex, subatomic behavior that creates reality and maintains its coherency. That would be the explicate order. The implicate order of a comic book reality is the comic itself and the pages within it. The explicate order is everyone in the credits box, not to mention all the people and machinery necessary to print and then distribute the comic. Within the comic book, the characters are unaware of all the forces that go into creating the reality. They also don't know their reality is restricted to something we call a panel. Furthermore, that panel is a 2-dimensional representation of their reality on the surface of a 3-dimensional plane. This plane is what we call a comic book page. Finally, the so-called subatomic god, the entity responsible for creating this reality, is Grant Morrison. One of the more popular analogies to illustrate implicate order involves a droplet of ink in a highly viscous substance. If the container holding these liquids is spun in one direction, the ink becomes diffuse and seems to disappear. However, if that container is spun in the opposite direction, the ink coheres into a drop again. The artwork implies this analogy. The drops of blood red ink are suspended in the air against the empty panel background. The container is the page, rather than any specific panel. This is echoed much later in Animal Man issue number 19. This analogy also applies to the psycho-pirate, who will be introduced later. As more characters escape containment within his mind, he becomes translucent or more diffuse, like a drop of ink in a spinning container. There is one more literary term to add: Deus ex machina. Animal Man is loaded with this element. The character, James Highwater, is literally a walking, talking Deus ex machina. His entire purpose is to inorganically drive the meta-story forward. The Deus ex machina in the Coyote Gospel is the god that exiles Crafty. Of course, this would be the cartoonish representation of Grant Morrison. Despite being a writer, he's presented as an artist wielding a brush. This is likely intended to evoke another Looney Tunes cartoon, Duck Amuck. In the end, the Coyote Gospel is the first time Grant Morrison began to explore the implicate order of comic book reality, not to mention his place within it, as he explores various themes and stories. One could argue it's a very good organic first draft of an element he will continually explore in the future within a variety of works. The Coyote Gospel is concise. It contains an actual coherent narrative with an organic blend of meta-story and high-concept elements just below the straightforward, relatable surface. Unlike some of Morrison's future work, the meta-story doesn't overtake the actual story. This may be due to the concepts not being fully formed, and because Morrison's mainstream career is just beginning. He doesn't have the reputation to overtly indulge in the concepts that intellectually occupy his mind. Either way, as a blueprint or a statement of intent, the Coyote Gospel is a great introduction to a series that would challenge the reader to question their definition of entertainment and the effect that cheap melodramatics have on the lives of two-dimensional characters.